and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker, and today I'm really excited. We have a special treat for you guys. I'm being joined by two special guests. So the first one is Dr. Liz Jackson. Hey there, Liz.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on.
You're welcome. Welcome to the show. And the other person, he's no stranger. He's been on many times, is my former, not old, former skeptical co-host, David Johnson. Hey, David.
Hello.
Welcome back. So yeah, today's show is going to be kind of following up on, we did Skeptics and Seekers did an epistemology or religious epistemology extravaganza, I believe they called it. So we're actually going to be tipping that off with an actual expert in epistemology, Dr. Liz Jackson. And we're going to be following it up by a discussion of Pascal's wager as well. But just before we get into today's topics, I want to turn it over to my guests just to kind of introduce us as to who they are, maybe tell us a little bit about your faith journey and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'll turn it straight over to you, Liz. Do you want to introduce us as to who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. So, where do I start? I have been a Christian for a very long time, and I am still a Christian. So I grew up in a Christian home. I don't think there's ever been a period in my life when I wasn't a Christian, but I definitely went through very serious points of questioning and doubting. And I think part of that is because I always had lots and lots of questions. And as a child, I was like that why kid, like times 100. I was just constantly asking my parents, like, who created God? And, all those kinds of questions. So maybe jumping forward a little bit, I think in college, I was sort of trying to decide what to major in. And I thought, like, maybe I'll do math, maybe I'll do, like, political science. I had all these different ideas, and I was like, maybe I should try a philosophy class. Like, I don't even really know what philosophy is, but maybe I'll just try one. And I took moral and political philosophy in my very first philosophy class, and I was like, these are my people. This is what I've been interested in my whole life. And it was this huge eye-opening moment. And then I was like, I'm a philosophy major. And my parents were like, are you sure? And I was like, yep. And then, took a little convincing. And then I was like, I'm going to grad school. And they're like, really? And I was like, no, yeah, I really want to. So they're totally on board with it now. And they love that I do philosophy. But it definitely is one of those things that's like, really, my kid's going to be a philosophy major. But anyway, so I did my bachelor's degree in philosophy at Kansas State University. And then I did my master's and PhD at the University of Notre Dame. And so after that, I did a 1-year postdoc. So I got paid to do research. It was awesome. At Australian National University. It was actually a pretty weird year because that was the year of all the Australian fires, and then also the year that COVID happened. And so I was supposed to be there for over a year, and I was really only there for like 5 or 6 months because I was constantly like trying to escape natural disasters and pandemics and, lots of things. So weird, but good year. Australia's amazing. I really enjoyed the time I lived there, even though it was short. And then now I teach philosophy at Ryerson University in Toronto, although because we're remote, I'm actually not in Toronto right now. But yeah, I guess like a little bit about maybe my faith journey, just briefly. And I think I kind of said this already, but, I think I grew up in a Christian home, so I was a Christian most of my life, but I definitely went through periods, especially in college, where I had tons and tons of questions. I had a lot of professors that I would ask questions to, and sometimes their answers would be more or less satisfying. And I actually had a professor who was a Christian when he taught me, and then ended up coming out as an atheist. And that was a really interesting experience for me, and in some ways very faith-shaking, because he was someone I had been asking all these questions to and really looked up to, and then he's like, I'm an atheist now. And so I think that was a big part of the reason that I wanted to become a professor, just because I saw how much professors affect the way people think, and just the influence that they have. And I love philosophy, was a big part of it, but I also wanted to kind of have a positive influence on people around me. And one thing I really love is that, obviously doing that at Ryerson is great, but we have YouTube now, you know, and so it's cool to be able to for philosophers to not just have the students at their university, but be able to do things like this and then you know, influence even more people. So that's one reason I really love podcasts and you know, YouTube channels like yours, Dale, and I'm really excited to be here. So
Awesome. I fully concur with your sentiments. You know, I love philosophy as well, and I love these the ability that we have now to like get out to a wide market and stuff, and introduce new ideas to people and stuff like that. So awesome. All right. So turning over to you, David, just for, I know the audience will be familiar with you, but just for Liz's benefit and for anyone else in the audience that doesn't know who you are, do you want to just sort of give us a quick introduction as to who you are and where you're coming from? Oh, you're on mute. Just so you know.
My bad. Sorry. Yeah, I'm David Johnson. I was born and raised conservative Christian, very conservative, very Christian. I was a part of the church life at a very young age. My father was a preacher, and so I had a lot of inside access, you might say, at a very early age. I started preaching publicly at about 12. I went through various leadership roles in the church, from youth minister to assistant minister. I was in the ministry for a number of years, probably more years as a minister than not a minister in the church. And roughly 10, 11 years ago, my religious journey came to an end. It wasn't necessarily an abrupt end, and it wasn't a smooth stop. It was difficult. It was a long time coming, but when it came, there was no going back. And it's not like I didn't try. So I came from about the most insidery position in the church to being as outsidery as you can get now. And my religious experience took me through several belief systems, several denominations. I was a leader of some description in at least 3 different denominations. And so my journey and experience has been broad, and my decision, my current beliefs did not come easy or lightly, but here I am. And I still enjoy the conversation, because after spending that much time in religion, in some degree, that's all you know. You can't walk away from it. So, I mean, what does, and it's not like I had any academic training to speak of, but if you just ask yourself, well, what would an academic, like say a Randall Rouser, for instance, do if he came to no longer believe in God? What talent does he have left? He's a writer. He writes about these things. He teaches about these things. He would stay in the conversation, because that's all you know at a certain point. A lot of people ask me, why do I still talk about this stuff? Well, I mean, that's all I know. So I think I will always enjoy the conversation, just from a very different perspective than I used to.
Gotcha. Now that you're a podcaster, do you appreciate coming across new ideas and that sort of thing that kind of change your opinion on anything? Or
I've always enjoyed random conversation about just about anything, but because I have developed some expertise on religion, on theology and counter theology, I think that's probably going to be something that I will always enjoy at some level. There are weeks when I don't want to do this. There are weeks when I'm really sick of it and I want to get on with my life. And then I look around and realize, oh, wait a minute, I don't have one of those. This is my life. So I guess I'd better turn the mic back on. So.
Awesome. All right, cool. So All right, thanks. So yeah, like I think what we can do now is let's get straight into the actual topics. So the first section is going to be on religious epistemology proper. And the first little bit, I'm going to interview Liz, get her sort of thoughts on this, and then I'll open it up after that to an informal discussion between the two, between David and Liz. So yeah, Liz, do you maybe want to start us off by, okay, so we're talking about epistemology and religious beliefs. So in the first place, what is epistemology? And how do you think that applies to religious propositions or religious beliefs and that sort of thing?
Yeah, definitely. So the way I often define epistemology, it's usually defined as the study of knowledge, but I often throw and rational belief in there as well. So I think, epistemologists ask questions about what is knowledge, how do we define it, and then what is the scope of our knowledge? Do we know lots of things, or do we only know a few things, or do we know nothing? So that's a big question in epistemology, but I think now a lot of epistemologists are also really interested in the question, what should we believe? And even kind of taken apart from questions of knowledge, just questions about rational belief. But I will say this too, that when you look at the most common definitions of knowledge, most people think knowledge is justified true belief, and then there's this fourth component that has to do with these cases that are called Gettier cases, and I don't think we need to necessarily get into those today, but the point is, so there's these four components of knowledge, and then two of those are justified belief. So, when you think about rational or justified belief, it is a part of knowledge, and so epistemology, I think, a lot of it kind of comes back to looking at knowledge or looking at certain ingredients of knowledge. I guess one thing I'll say as well, that kind of a part of epistemology that's even maybe like less concerned with knowledge. Recently, there's been this thing in epistemology that's called formal epistemology. And what they do in formal epistemology, I'm just bringing this up because it's going to be important later, is that instead of just thinking about what do you know or what do you believe, and when we ask the question, what do you believe or what should you believe, most people think for each proposition or each statement, you can believe it, you can withhold belief on it, or you can disbelieve it. So really there's three main attitudes you can take. I believe it's sunny today, I withhold belief that there's an even number of hairs on my head, and I disbelieve that 1 + 1 = 3. And so I think a lot of epistemology was working in this framework. And then formal epistemology actually says, well, we can actually model our beliefs in an even more precise way. And so what they do is they actually model how confident you are that something is true on a scale from 0 to 1, where 0 is like, I'm 100% sure it's false, and then 1 is like, I'm 100% sure it's true. So, I might believe it's sunny today and believe that 1 + 1 = 2, but I'm more confident that 1 + 1 = 2 than that it's sunny today, especially if I can't see outside directly and I saw it was sunny earlier maybe, but I'm not looking at the looking outside right now. And so arguably the framework where we just have belief, withholding, and disbelief, it can't capture everything. And so formal epistemologists say, well, we need this more specific, more fine-grained way of talking about our attitudes towards statements or propositions. And so we can have 0.99 credence, we can have 0.5 credence, we can have, our credences can kind of go all over this map, and we can be really specific about what our credence or levels of confidence are. So I wanted to bring that up partially because credences are going to be important for some of the things we're going to talk about later, but also because this was actually my dissertation topic. So my dissertation was about the relationship between believing something and then having a credence in it. How do those two attitudes fit together? So maybe I'll talk a little bit about religious epistemology. So epistemology is cool because it can really be applied to almost any topic. You can talk about what you should believe, what credence you should have, whether you could know, really anything. But I think one interesting topic, and one topic that's gotten a lot of has been written on it, it's our topic today, right? Whether it could be rational to believe that God existed, or whether someone could even ever know that God existed. So yeah, religious epistemology is a super important and super interesting part of epistemology. And I think one kind of thing that comes up, which is another area of research I'm really interested in, is how does faith fit into all of this? What is faith? Is faith just a kind of belief? Is faith different than belief? And then what makes faith rational? Could faith ever be rational? And so I have a couple. I don't want to be too long, but one thing I will note is what's interesting about faith is that faith seems to involve our desires in a way that belief doesn't. So when I could believe lots of things I don't want to be true, like that there's a pandemic, that I was late to this meeting today, whatever. But when it comes to faith, if I have faith that something's true, that requires a desire for that thing to be true. So I think that's one way that faith and belief are different. I also think, though, that faith can remain steadfast in the light of counter evidence. So whether that's faith in your spouse, or faith in yourself, or faith in God, I think that even if you get some counter evidence that kind of makes you doubt a commitment that you made, I think faith can remain steadfast in light of counter evidence. But I'm not one of those people that thinks like the less evidence you have, the better the faith, right? So I think if at some point you get so much evidence that counts against a commitment that you made or a statement that you have faith in, then I think you should give up your faith. I guess, I don't know if you wanted me to talk about the control thing. I guess another kind of unorthodox view that I have is I do think we can sometimes control our beliefs. That's kind of another issue that epistemologists are interested in, is like, to what extent can we control our beliefs? And then if we can't control our beliefs, how could we be responsible for them? If beliefs just happen to us, how could we praise or blame people? Like if someone had a racist belief, we'd say like, you shouldn't have that belief, you're blameworthy. But how can we make sense of that if people can't control their beliefs? And so my view is actually that we can control some of our beliefs, and I think we'll get into this more when we talk about Pascal's wager.
Interesting. Excellent. All right. So yeah, I wanted to, I definitely want to ask you about that, because I'm sort of skeptical that we can control it. I think it's an indirect, doxastic, voluntarist, I think, is the position that I take. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your take on that. Awesome. So the next question, and I know David's really excited about this question, hearing your take on this, is, okay, great. So you've explained to us in general what knowledge is, and how the belief versus credence distinction works in terms of things like religious propositions. What type of evidences or methodologies do you think we can use to gain religious knowledge in particular?
Yeah, so I think there's like at least two that are worth mentioning. The first is arguments. Arguments, I think, definitely count as evidence. Arguments for God's existence are an important source of evidence for theism. So I definitely am not one of those people that say arguments aren't evidence, or, arguments are definitely evidence, right? But I do think it's tricky here, because it seems like there are good arguments on both sides. Like, it seems like there's really interesting arguments for God's existence, but there's also some really interesting arguments against. And, maybe for some people, they really think the evidence supports one or the other, but I don't know if arguments are always going to tip the scales for people. I think it's really interesting, actually, cases where someone's like, I just looked at the evidence and I saw that theism is true. I'm very open to that possibility, but I think that's not everyone's experience. I'll say it that way. So we can talk more about this. This is actually relevant to some of the stuff that I was going to mention on Pascal's wager as well. I'm interested in the idea that theism and atheism might both be supported by the evidence, but there might be other asymmetries we can draw between them that I think are interesting, that aren't just like, theism clearly has all the arguments and atheism doesn't, So that's something we can talk more about later. But I think the second kind of thing to note about this is that there's a lot of things that we believe, not even talking necessarily about God's existence or religious epistemology, that aren't, but a lot of things we believe are not based on arguments. If I believe like I'm in pain, I just experience the pain. It's not like I'm like, premise 1, I feel pain. Premise 2, if I feel pain, then I'm in pain. Therefore I'm in pain. I just believe I'm in pain. I think a lot of times when we perceive objects, we don't argue ourselves into believing in them. We just see a microphone or, see a book and we're like, there's a microphone, there's a book. So we're not believing these things on the basis of an argument. When we see people's emotions, similar kind of thing. And so I want to say that this is not always irrational. I think a lot of times we can perceive things or just like immediately feel something and form a belief, and it's not based on an argument, and that's not irrational. And so another thing I'm really interested in is the possibility that this kind of framework could apply to belief in God as well. And I guess there's sort of two main works that have been done about this that I think are interesting, but the first is a book by William Alston that's called Perceiving God. And William Alston argues that when we have a religious experience and we sense God in some way, whether that's with our five senses or with some other spiritual sense, you could go either way on that, right? But he thinks that in the same way that if I see a tree and form a belief there's a tree, I could experience God and then form a belief that God exists. And in both cases, it could at least be potentially rational, depending on, other factors. If I know that they're filming a movie outside and they have a bunch of fake trees out there, then I might not just believe there's a tree because I see a tree. But in most cases, if you see a tree, you believe there's a tree. And so in the same way, when you perceive God, that doesn't mean every single time it's rational for you to believe in God, but I do think sometimes experiencing God or perceiving God could make it rational to believe in God without an explicit argument. The other thing I was going to mention is Plantinga talks about the sensus divinitatis. Sensus divinitatis is a part of our minds, supposedly, that Plantinga argues is designed to form beliefs about God. So when you are walking in nature and seeing beautiful mountains or seeing a sunset, or when you're in trouble and you cry out to God for help, or various situations like this, Plantinga thinks what's going on is your sensus divinitatis is being activated, and that part of your mind is designed to form beliefs about God. And so if that part of your mind is functioning properly when you form those beliefs about God, Plantinga has this extensive argument that that can be rational, and then maybe even that could amount to knowledge. So that's another interesting case as well, because that seems like, again, a case where you're not believing in God on the basis of a specific argument, but Plantinga has a very detailed story that we probably don't have time to get into today about why he thinks that could be rational.
Awesome. I have one follow-up for you, if you don't mind. So you mentioned these various methods or that sort of thing. Would you say that these methods are mutually exclusive, or could there be a combination? Like maybe I believe on the basis of, in part, based on arguments, and in part based on a properly based belief. What's your take on that? Are they mutually exclusive, or could they be combined in some way?
They're absolutely not mutually exclusive at all. And I think a lot of people probably, I don't know. It depends on how many people you think are aware of basic arguments for God's existence, but I think at least a decent number of people are. So I think at least a decent number of people probably have some of both, and I think that's totally legit. And I think that makes perfect sense. And I think in the same way, I mean, that could be true of non-religious cases as well. You could believe that something exists on the basis of an argument and because you saw it or something. So yeah, I totally think both it can be legitimate to base your belief in God on both at the same time. And then if you find out like one of the arguments isn't as good as you thought, then you still have something else to sort of rely on. And I think the other thing I want to say too is I feel like a lot of people think, well, you need to believe in God because God like revealed himself or something, or because the Holy Spirit spoke to you or something. And they want to resist like arguments because of that sort of reasoning. And that kind of thing makes no sense to me, because I see no reason why God couldn't reveal himself or the Holy Spirit couldn't work through arguments. So I'm totally open to the idea that God works in both of these ways, and both of these ways are ways that God reveals himself. Both of these ways are ways that the Holy Spirit speaks to us. And so I don't want to say like arguments are this like this bad way of looking at God where you're using human reason, and then there's these other ways that are actually God revealing himself. No, I don't buy that distinction at all. So I'm definitely like, in a lot of ways, a both and person, I think.
Awesome. Yep, I fully agree. My one was taken the both and approach, so I fully agree with that. So, all right, awesome.
Mind if I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can ask.
Yeah. So I would not say that arguments are evidence, but I encounter a lot of Christians who would disagree with this idea that you can just rationalize your way, argue your way into Christianity without any type of experience with the divine. And they would very much disagree with that. So never mind the skeptics for a moment. Just I think I know more Christians who would disagree with you than skeptics even. That somehow it's enough to just have arguments. What do you say to them? Do you have any interaction with them? How does that conversation go?
Yeah, no, totally. So maybe this is helpful because it can kind of clarify my position on this too. So I think it is complex what it takes to be a Christian. What all do you need to be counted as a Christian? And can having just an argument for God's existence give you that? I guess I didn't necessarily want to go that far, and here's why. It has to do with actually what faith is. So remember I was saying, when you believe something, often you'll have evidence for it, but it doesn't require any desire for it to be true. But I think being a Christian isn't just believing that God exists. I think it involves faith that God exists. And what's interestingly different about faith, again, is that we have these desires. So when you have faith that something is true, you need to want it to be true. So I think when we're encountering, like I totally think arguments can give you that belief aspect. They can give you that evidence aspect. I don't think you have to have an experience of God. I know people that have never had experiences of God that are Christians, and I think they are Christians and can be Christians. But I think in addition to believing that God exists, they need to think that God's existence would be a good thing. They need to desire for God to exist. And that's what's arguably at least one of the important ingredients to turn belief into faith. And so having just the argument isn't enough. You also need to think God's existence would be a good thing. I don't necessarily think that's a really hard desire to come to have. I don't think I think a lot of people just think if there was an alternative. Oh, go ahead.
It feels
sorry.
like a hard desire to come by. It's a hard desire to come by for me.
Yeah.
It's a hard desire to come by from a lot of people I know. It's not actually a natural thing, I think, for us to want a literal overlord who tells us what to do, and that we have to obey or suffer some retribution. That's not something that I think we naturally want. There's also the idea that maybe some people have a misconception of who and what God is. Maybe they got the bad religious teaching and they don't want that to be true. So I think it is asking quite a lot to say, well, you've got to want it to be true. That's very presuppositional at that point. If it's true, I need to be able to see that it's true, whether I want it to be true or not.
Well, sure. I mean, I'm not saying I'm not saying that you should only want it to be true. You should also see that it's true. But I think making a commitment to God and having faith that God exists, it requires a desire for God, at least on some level, right? And I think you could desire God to exist, but also think there's things about God's existence that you don't like, in the same way I can desire to work out but also not like going to the gym every day or something, you know? So I do think our desires are complicated. And I do think you're right that I spoke too quickly, so I shouldn't have said that it's very easy to want God to exist or everyone should want God to exist. I do think it depends on the person. And I guess I was just thinking in some cases that desire comes naturally, but I think you're right that there's interesting reason to think there's an interesting debate to be had there. And it's actually funny. So one of the professors at Ryerson, this is one of his main areas of research. It's not the question of whether God exists, but the question of whether we should want God to exist. Would it be a good thing? And a lot of the considerations you bring up are reasons that people say it wouldn't be a good thing. But I think on the other hand, there's reason to think it would be a good thing too. There's a all-powerful, all-good creator who is taking care of you, has a plan for your life. There's a possibility you could live forever and be united with this all-good, all-powerful being. And then if Christianity is true, like Jesus took your sin and your guilt away and conquered death. And so I'm not trying to settle this here. I'm just trying to say, I think there's reasons on both sides. And the main point is that you can't just have the arguments. I think you need on some level that desire as well, at least to have faith.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I'm hoping to have, I don't want to mention his name in case he doesn't want to be on the podcast, but yeah, I would love to have that professor and talk about pro-theism versus anti-theism at some point. I think that'd be interesting. So,
hey,
all right.
Hey, invite me back for that one when you get it.
Okay, all right. Yeah, if he agrees, for sure. Yeah, all right. Okay, so moving on. One thing that I've gotten a lot of flack from skeptics, including David, and that sort of thing, is the use of probabilities to make these types of judgments about does God exist, or is this religion true, or something like that. Do you want to maybe speak, what role do probabilities play in our making rational decisions about religious propositions and the evidence we have for it? And maybe if you can include in that, one of the main objections I got, so this is for you, Anthony 66, he's a PhD mathematician. Are the use of subjective probabilities valid, or does it have to be only statistical, objective type probabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would be interested in actually hearing why people don't like using probabilities, because I guess I like them. I don't know. But yeah, that would be interesting to hear their reasoning. But in my view, I think probabilities are super useful in decision making. And I do think we actually use them quite a bit of the time. And one thing that the psychological evidence shows that I think is super interesting, and I talked about this in my dissertation, is that when the stakes get higher, we actually tend to think more probabilistically about things. So here's an example that I will often give to kind of illustrate this. So if you, let's say you share an office with someone named Rachel. I shared an office with someone named Rachel in grad school, so I often use that example. And you come into the office one day and you don't see Rachel, but you do see her coat and her backpack in the office. And then you're kind of walking down the hallway and your friend says, "Is Rachel in today?" And you're like, "Yeah, she's in. I saw her coat and backpack." And then you just keep walking, not a big deal. I think that's a very common thing. And I think what we're doing there is, on the basis of that evidence, seeing her coat and backpack, we're forming the belief she's in today. And then when you're walking down the hallway and your friend asks you, you're kind of relying on that belief to answer your friend. So I don't think, at least in terms of the question of is Rachel in today, I don't know if we're reasoning probabilistically in that case. But let's say the stakes get way higher. So let's say there's a murder in your office and the cops are there and they need a list of every single person who is in today so they can figure out who the suspects are. In that case, I think what you're going to do is you're going to think more probabilistically about the proposition Rachel is in today. And what you'll probably tell the cops is, well, I didn't see Rachel. I saw her coat and backpack. So I'm like 98% sure she was in, but I'm not positive. There's a chance that she left them there overnight and she wasn't here. You probably want to ask some more people. So I think it's interesting that when we move to a high stakes scenario, we tend to engage in more probabilistic reasoning. I think that has a ton of implications for a lot of different interesting issues, but I do think probabilistic reasoning is really useful when trying to figure out what exactly does our evidence support when we need to make a decision that is higher stakes. And so the method that I think a lot of philosophers think is really good for making decisions like this, it's called decision theory. And I might talk about this a little bit more when we get into the Pascal's wager stuff, but basically in decision theory, you think about the different decisions that you could make. So you could think about, should I bring an umbrella today or not? So maybe those are your two choices. And then you think about the possibilities for the way the world could be. And then the relevant possibilities here would be like, it rains and it doesn't rain. And then based on the probability that it rains versus not rain, and then, you know, how annoying it would be to carry an umbrella if it didn't rain and how good it would be to not get wet, you can actually kind of put numbers in and then figure out whether you should bring an umbrella or not. And so you mentioned this idea of subjective probabilities. So subjective probabilities basically just are credences, the thing I was talking about earlier, where we sort of take your confidence in some statement or proposition, and then we say, how confident are you? Are you 100% sure, 0, somewhere in the middle? And most decision theorists think that what we do in decision theory is we actually just take those subjective probabilities, put them into the decision theory, and then it spits out what we should do. I guess there's a reason they do this, but I see why your friend thinks there's a danger here. So I'll say something about both. The reason that they do this is because decision theory isn't a tool that's meant to tell you what subjective probabilities or what credences you should have. There are other tools that are meant to do that, and that's basically what Bayesian epistemology is. It's a theory of rational credences. So decision theory isn't trying to tell you what credences you should or shouldn't have. So I think it's just taking it outside of what decision theory is even concerned with. Decision theory is about telling you how you can be rational given your credences, and then also how good or bad you think certain states of the world would be. So it's almost how to be means and rational, how to be rational given your beliefs and your desires, right? On the other hand, if your credences are totally uninformed or very irrational or not coherent with each other or something, then when you put them into decision theory, you're going to get really weird results. And so I think it is important that your credences are based on evidence or informed to an extent. I mean, there's different ways you can go here of how high of a bar you want this to be. But I think especially if your credences aren't coherent, you're going to get super weird results with decision theory. But if your credences don't match your evidence, I think that could also be a big problem. And I think most people think your credences should match your evidence. But there's a separate issue of getting your credences in line, and then this other thing, decision theory is this other thing. So they're almost two different research programs. So I hope does that help, Dale? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, let me ask, so I take the Bayesian approach, or a Bayesish approach, where I use Bayes' theorem, and I utilize subjective probabilities even in that context. And what I say is, look, there's a reasonableness range, as long as I can prove that whatever subjective value I give falls within this objective reasonableness range, and that's fine. We can allow for flexibility. Do you think that's valid in a Bayesian sense as well? I take yes.
Yeah, totally. And I think, there are certain things like coherence that are really important, because if you have a 90% chance it will rain and a 90% chance it won't rain, then trying to make a decision on that basis is just going to be you're just going to be really confused. So that might be something that falls out of that reasonableness range. But I think as long as you meet certain basic constraints, I think we can use subjective probabilities pretty well in decision theory. And some people actually think if your credences are too convoluted, it doesn't even count as a credence function because it's just not, you can't even really make sense of it from a probabilistic standpoint. So there's also questions about like, when is it not even a credence function anymore, But yeah, I think we're basically on the same page here.
All right,
What if
cool.
I ask a follow-up question?
So yeah, I know you had your question here. Okay, ask one follow-up and then save the rest for the discussion part. So I want to make sure we have time for that.
Okay, well, this may best be saved for the discussion part. I don't know. I thought I heard you say earlier that Bayes' theorem needed more solid numbers than a general decision theory. But you just answered, Dale, that you don't really need the solid numbers. And so when do you need solid numbers and when do you not need solid numbers to make probabilities make sense?
What do you mean by solid numbers?
So, like, for instance, the kind of probabilities that I think the average person uses, and I would argue the average person doesn't really use anything that looks like probabilities, but to the extent that we use probabilities in our daily life at all, it's more of an emotional gut instinct kind of thing. We're not doing math when we say, well, there's a 30% chance of whatever. We don't know. That's a very emotional number, and so it doesn't seem like you should be able to plug that into something as formal as a Bayes theorem, and come up with a reliable answer if all we're doing is using emotional numbers. And it seems that humans are really bad at determining probabilities anyway, especially when it comes to large numbers. We're lousy at calculating our real chances of, say, winning a lottery. Our eyes get big. It's $1 billion worth of lottery winnings. A ticket is $1. Maybe $100 worth of tickets is a good idea today. No, it's not.
Yeah.
But we're really bad
Right.
at understanding that. So,
Yeah.
that's what I would call an emotional probability that doesn't seem to be actually very useful in something like a Bayesian calculation.
Yeah, so I definitely think I agree with the lottery thing, and I also think in general we aren't the best. Like, we make systematic errors in probabilistic reasoning. And I don't know if you've heard of Daniel Kahneman, but he has done a bunch of research on this that I think is super compelling. He has a book that's called Thinking Fast and Slow. That is so good. So if you're interested in, just for the audience, if you're interested in this issue, that's a book I highly recommend. It's very interesting. And yeah, I mean, I do think decision theory and Bayesianism, that's why we actually kind of need them, right? Because they're these normative theories that tell us how to be rational. And what's interesting is that in most cases, I don't think every case, but in most cases, playing the lottery, decision theory is going to actually tell you that that's irrational. The problem is that people don't actually take the time to sit down and do a decision calculation with that. They just really focus on this possibility that they win and then let that kind of overwhelm their decision. So that's one thing to say, but I do think you're right that we can assign probabilities irrationally, but I think where I would disagree is that we're always irrational. Like, you can just think about basic cases where if I check the forecast and there's a 90% chance of rain tomorrow, then I form a 0.9 credence that it will rain tomorrow. Or I'm about to roll a 6-sided die and I form a 1 in 6 credence that it will land a 6, or flipping a coin, or, so I do think there are certain cases where we can form precise credences and they do conform to our evidence pretty well. But you're right that we need to be careful. And if we're just kind of pulling a credence out of nothing, I think that can be a problem. I do think it should be based on our evidence, and it definitely needs to be coherent with our other credences. So that's why I was saying before, decision theory does take your credences as inputs, but they do need to be at least coherent with each other. And I want to say that when we're evaluating the rationality of your credences, they need to be based on your evidence. So decision theory isn't a tool for evaluating the rationality of credences, but I think if you want to be both epistemically and practically rational, you need to have rational credences and then put those into decision theory to be both epistemically and practically rational. So I think the point earlier was just that decision theory, the main goal of decision theory isn't to tell you if your credences are rational or irrational, but you can be extra rational if you're rational in both senses. But I think decision theory just isn't going to work out if your credences don't at least meet certain constraints like coherence.
Okay. All right. So my next question is kind of following up on this topic of probabilities, and this one is a key one. Once again, I've been over it and that sort of thing. And what is the standard of proof? So if we do base our things on probabilities, is 51% the cutoff, or should it be 70% before we believe something, or like what should the standard of proof be if we're using probabilities? You've kind of already answered this. I was asking as well, do the stakes or the potential importance of the beliefs in question make a difference to where that standard should be set? And then I also wanted you to incorporate, what about cases of permissivism versus the uniqueness thesis and how that might relate to this standard?
I see. Okay, so actually I think when I was reading this question, I was thinking of burden of proof, but by standard of proof, you mean when should we form a belief? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry. So I think some of the things I was thinking in answer to this might not apply. So I guess one really common view on this, it's what's called the Lockean thesis. And so on the Lockean thesis, it's rational for you to believe a statement when your credence in that statement is above some threshold. So there's different views on what that threshold should be, but I think a lot of epistemologists are sympathetic to at least a version of the Lockean thesis. You could have it lower, like around the 0.5 range. You could have it higher, closer to 1, somewhere in the middle. I actually don't think the Lockean thesis holds all the time, but I do think it's a good rule of thumb that in general we should and we do believe the things that we're pretty confident in, the things that we have high credences in. One really interesting view that relates to that second question about stakes. So one big problem for the Lockean thesis is, how do you set the standard, or the threshold, that's the word I was thinking of, the threshold. How do you set that at a place that doesn't just look ad hoc, that doesn't just look like you just threw it on there, just like this random threshold? And that's where stakes, I think, can come in an interesting way. So again, this actually isn't my view, but I think it's a really interesting view, so I'm just going to talk about it. I think one really interesting idea is that what the threshold or the standard is can go up or down depending on what's at stake. And so in really low stakes situations, you might need less evidence in order to rationally believe something. So your credence, you could form a credence at like a 0.6, maybe your credence is 0.6, then you can form belief. But if the stakes get really high, then it seems like you need more evidence and higher credence to form that belief. So I'm trying to look at my notes really quick, but yeah, so I think in general, like, think about the Rachel case I gave with The Office. It's like, when the stakes were really low, we had kind of formed that belief, we settled that question, that Rachel was in today, Rachel, her stuff was in there, and that was good enough evidence for us. But then when the stakes got a lot higher, it seemed like you could say what happened is that standard went up, and so then you're no longer relying on your belief. Some people would even maybe say you gave up that belief. I wouldn't go that far, but you could say that you gave up that belief, and then you were withholding belief, and when you answered the cops, that's why you said, I'm not sure, but there's a pretty good chance of it. So that's one kind of interesting view that I think you could have. So I think the question of permissivism is super interesting. So permissivism is the view that two people can share evidence, or, just given even one person my evidence, there could be more than one rational way to respond to that evidence. So one example I like to give a lot is jurors. They hear all the same evidence about who committed the crime, but one juror might say Smith is guilty and the other juror might say Smith is innocent. And so the thought is they do share evidence, their evidence is the same, but the evidence might be complicated and it might be really hard to evaluate. And so arguably this case is one where evidence is permissive. What that means is the person who thinks Smith is guilty and the person who thinks Smith is innocent could both be rational. Just because they disagree doesn't automatically mean one of them is irrational. And so one thing that I think this could also relate to the question about stakes that I think is a really interesting idea is that, let's say you're in a permissive case where your evidence maybe makes it rational to withhold belief on something, but also you have evidence that can make it rational to believe it. Maybe the stakes could kind of break the tie there. And if it's in a low stakes scenario, maybe you could believe it, but if it's in a high stakes scenario, maybe you should withhold belief on it. And what's really interesting there is, like, it's not like you're going against your evidence or you're believing something that the evidence doesn't support, but the stakes are basically acting as this epistemic tiebreaker. So they're saying the epistemic leaves it open, and so the stakes can kind of break the tie.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because for me, I kind of wrestled with this threshold question myself when I was doing my research. Ultimately, I'm not sure I would go for permissivism, even though I recognize, at least internally, you can have two attitudes towards something. I kind of went with these ranges. I was thinking about maybe there's an agnostic range, 45 to 50. So when I converted to Christianity, I'm a weirdo. I got 53.14%. And that's within this agnostic range. So I had to ask, is that enough for me to believe? And in the end, I kind of decided the only non-arbitrary one is to go with more probable than not and apportion your belief accordingly. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
So I'll say really quickly, like I said, I'm actually not a Lockean, so I don't think that belief just directly depends on whatever your credence is. I do think it's more complicated than that, I guess, is basically the quick way of putting it. But if I were, I think I would want that threshold or that standard to be pretty low, to be around 0.5. And what's interesting too, I know we're already over time, but you could say that once it hits like 0.5, it's permissible for you to believe it. But then once it hits like 0.9, it's required for you to believe it. So you could have a kind of permissibility standard and then a requirement standard as well.
Gotcha. Perfect. And just so you know, in terms of time, I'm totally flexible. So you don't have to worry. If you want to share something, go ahead. So all right, cool. So David, I do want to turn it to you on this one, because I know this is something we've kind of discussed in previous shows on SNS. So okay, let me ask you, what do you think the standard of proof should be for believing or disbelieving propositions, and religious propositions in specifically?
Well, I think that religious propositions are quite high. In the Lysian understanding of that, I agreed with that. I mean, when the stakes are low, then you could conditionally believe something. When the stakes are high, you have to get a lot more serious about it, and proof has to be better. So I think that religious propositions are, by their very nature, extremely high. So I don't think that a 50.1% probability is reasonable with something as high as religion. The stakes are too important for that. I think that's barely permissive, because you're in the range of the margin of error here, and it's certainly not required that you believe at that range. And I think what happens with a lot of religious people is they just refuse to admit that it is, in fact, reasonable not to be fully convinced, even if the probability, you come up with some probabilistic number that's 50.1%.
Mm.
And so they effect a belief that is higher than the probability suggests. Christians don't tend to talk about, well, I think there's probably a God. They say there's definitely a God and you're going to go to hell if you don't believe in it. Evangelism is not the art of saying, well, there's probably a God and Christianity is probably a good path to go. That's not that's not the tack that most Christians take. And so I just think that they might have a 50 or 60% actual um, uh, understanding of the evidence, belief in the evidence, but they're presenting it in a way that's far more certain than that. And they pretend like the atheist is somehow being irrational if they don't buy it without a much stronger degree of certainty. So that would be the problem that I have with that. If I were 90% convinced that there was a God, that would probably be enough for me. But that kind of brings us to the other point, which I know that Liz wanted to get to, and I wanted to get to in some conversation, which is how do we even have a choice in what we believe? And I would think that at 90%, being 90% convinced, I don't think that I would have a choice. I think that I would believe. And I think if I have the choice to believe, then that's just another way of saying I don't believe. And at that point, it's just a matter of wish fulfillment. I want to believe or I don't want to believe. But ultimately, we believe or we don't believe. And so I think the better question is, at what percentage of certainty do we actually believe, rather than what percentage of certainty we should have where we should believe? Because I don't care where we should believe. I care where we actually do believe.
Gotcha. All right, cool. Yeah, thanks for answering that. And one thing maybe we'll get into later on during the discussion, or something that could come up, is could the high stakes actually lower the threshold? Maybe it's so important that actually we need less proof than 50% because the benefits are so great or something. But yeah, I'll save that for perhaps in the discussion period. So yeah, turning back to you, Liz, the last question of the interview thing. This is something that I'm taking in my philosophy of religion course, is this issue of pure disagreement, and in a religious context specifically. And a lot of people say, David, for example, as well as many skeptics on SNS, will say, they'll point to, but look, these other Christians disagree with you on this, or these other epistemic peers disagree with you about the existence of God, or that this proposition is true. So I just want to turn it to you. Obviously, it's a fact of nature. It's a fact that there are people who disagree with us on religious matters. What should we make of that, epistemologically speaking?
Yeah, I think there's a few things to say. So I think the first thing I want to say is that I think it's just really important that we acknowledge that different people often have very different evidence. And if we have very different evidence, it makes sense that we would both disagree. And I don't think that necessarily means that one of us is being irrational. If you have evidence I don't have, or I have evidence you don't have, we might have totally different takes on a certain matter. But what we should believe is relative to each of our different bodies of evidence. So I do think in some cases of religious disagreement, the religious and the non-religious, or the people of different religions, they just have very different evidence. And I think it's important to kind of realize that. And I think that can go at least part of the way to explaining some of the religious disagreement. But I think even if you have the same or very similar evidence, so I actually have like a very specific view of pure disagreement. And again, the distinction between belief and credence is really important for my view of pure disagreement. And so what my view is that if someone who's really smart and has evidence that is similar to you disagrees with you, you should lower your credence or lower your confidence in that proposition. But I think at least to a certain point, you can continue to hold on to your belief. One reason I really like this view is because, so maybe just stepping back a little bit, so in the sort of debate about disagreement, there's sort of two main views. One is called conciliationism, one is called steadfastness. So conciliationists say, when you encounter someone that has similar evidence to you and is sort of on your level epistemically, they're good at weighing the evidence, they're reliable, they're not biased, all that. When you encounter that kind of person, it just seems dogmatic and it seems closed-minded to just continue in your previous opinion and to just ignore the fact that they disagree with you and just say, nope, I'm just going to keep believing it and it doesn't matter that you disagreed with me. I'm not giving that any weight at all. Like, why are you treating yourself in such a special way? Like, you're basically just saying like, I'm right, you're wrong. You know, that seems a little bit epistemically suspicious. So that's what conciliationists say. But steadfasters say, no, actually, when you encounter someone smart and well-informed that disagrees with you, you actually can hold to your previous opinion. And the reason that they say this is, there's a couple reasons, but one is like, look, can't we have opinions about controversial matters? Like, do we really have to withhold belief about most political things, most religious things, most ethical things, at least the ones that are controversial? Like no, it doesn't. I mean, it seems like we can have strong opinions even in the face of disagreement. And, you know, it's like, you could even think about, even if you don't have an actual person that disagrees with you, you can imagine possible people that disagree with you. And it just seems like if we're constantly giving up our opinions in the face of disagreement, we're just going to have to be skeptics about a lot of things. And then the final thing to say in favor of steadfastness is that there's really, really interesting research that when a group of people disagree about a specific question, or they're trying to do research and they have different hypotheses that they're each favoring or advocating for or believing, this actually really helps that group reach the truth in the long run. They're much more likely to get the truth in the long run, as opposed to the case where they all just agree, they all just have the same favorite hypothesis or the same beliefs. And so I think that's really interesting as well, thinking about the benefits of disagreement and the ways that that can help groups reach the truth in the long run. Like, imagine if in philosophy we all just defended the same views. I think it would be a lot less interesting, but there would also, there would just be a ton of views that never get any airtime, you know? So here's why I really like my view. I think there's something to be said for the conciliationist thought that, like, it's dogmatic and closed-minded to just ignore it when your peers disagree with you. But there's something to be said for the steadfasters thought that, like, we can have controversial beliefs. We don't have to give up our belief on something just because it's controversial. And there's these benefits to disagreement. And so I'm like, look, if you're a conciliationist about your credences, but you're a steadfaster about your beliefs, it actually seems like we can kind of reap the benefits of both of these views. We can continue to hold our beliefs in the face of disagreement, but we should lower our credences to an extent. And then maybe at a certain point, when your credence just gets so low, you do need to give up that belief. But I think that we can sort of face quite a bit of disagreement and continue to hold our previously held opinion.
Okay. All right. So that's interesting. One thing, just as a follow-up from me, I'm interested in. Okay, so we lower our credences to an extent, but not so much that we lose our belief. Is there a way to determine what is the extent if we have this? Yeah, like, how do we figure out to what extent we should lower our credences?
Yeah. So that's a good question, and I think it's gonna. There's going to be several different factors you're going to want to weigh here. So one thing that's cool about the general view is that you can make it more steadfast or more conciliationist. So you can actually say, like, if you want it this view to be a more steadfast view, you could lower it less. If you want to make it a more conciliationist view, you could lower it more. So it is kind of flexible in that regard. But I do think there's a couple factors that we should think about, even setting that aside, about how much we should lower it. So the literature on disagreement really focuses on epistemic peers. So these people that are almost at your exact level epistemically, like basically the same evidence, same reliability, same epistemic virtues, etc. And part of what I think is like, maybe that's nice to talk about the idealized case, but there's not a lot of peers in real life. But I also think that doesn't really matter, because if I encounter someone that's really smart, but I have slightly better evidence than them, then it still seems like I should conciliate, but probably just less. And then if I encounter someone that has slightly better evidence than me or is slightly more reliable and they disagree with me, it seems like I should conciliate with them, but maybe even a little bit more. So I do think one factor that will play a role is what level, I guess, is the disagreeer at. And if they're at your level, or maybe a little bit less reliable, less good evidence than you, then you should conciliate less. But if they're really smart, or like just a little higher level, then you should conciliate more. And then also too, I think it's interesting to think about encountering people who disagree with you, and then also encountering people who agree with you. And then maybe if you can encounter smart people who agree with you, your credence should go back up. And so, your credences might change a decent amount depending on who you're encountering. But the way I'm imagining it, you can continue to hold that belief unless you're just encountering like tons of experts that all disagree with you, and not very many that agree with you.
Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, with that said, David, finally the time has arrived. So I'm going to open it up to an informal discussion. But David, before you do that, if the first thing you could do is maybe just kind of give us a quick idea of where you stand on this notion of peer disagreement, because I know it's something we discussed a couple of years ago. So.
Right. Well, I don't disagree with anything that Liz said.
Okay.
On peer disagreement. However, I do think that there's a whole other realm where the topic is relevant for skeptics that Christians kind of fail to address. So we encounter a lot of Christians that tell us that certain things about the spiritual realm are clear, they're obvious, if only we had the right attitude, mindset, approach to it. And yet when we look at Christians, that pure disagreement at the very least says, nope, doesn't seem to be clear at all, because here are people who are spiritual, educated, they seem like close enough peers to us. So that pure disagreement actually becomes a very powerful counter evidence to the idea of this spiritual thing being particularly clear. The other place where it is problematic is that when skeptics are listening to Christians, and let's say that you're dealing with a skeptic that's really open to considering the Christian faith, and yet they hear two different Christians saying very different things about God and Christianity. Maybe one believes that there's a universalist truth that God will ultimately save everyone. Another believes that no, it's very exclusivist, and the punishment is eternal torment in a blazing fire. These are two very different religions almost that's being taught. How is the skeptic supposed to evaluate this pure disagreement? We don't have any tools to evaluate that. And so I think this is where the problem is with pure disagreement, that I don't hear a lot of useful answers from Christians on. So I agree with everything that you said generically about pure disagreement, but can you address those theological concerns?
You're muted.
Sorry. Thanks. So is your first thought like, what about Christians who just say they just have very different evidence than the skeptics? And so it's almost like you can't even compare the two when it comes to peer disagreement. I just want to make sure I'm understanding. Like the second
Well,
thought is, how do you evaluate, universalist Christians versus ones who believe in hell? But is that the first thought?
no, well,
Or,
the first thought is, for instance, let's imagine an evangelistic scenario, and let's say that the person being evangelized to is a gay person, maybe a gay couple, and they listen to two different evangelists, and one evangelist says, "No, you have to. Homosexuality is an abomination." Um, and the other person says, "Oh no, God welcomes homosexuals fully into His kingdom." One says, "No, you've got to end this relationship." Another says, "No, we bless your relationship."
Mhm.
Uh, w- well, we don't. How is that gay couple supposed to evaluate when there is strong peer disagreement? Um, we're not say in the position of evaluating what the Bible says or means. We're not theologians. We're just people that theologians are talking to. But they're saying very different things. And this strong peer disagreement suggests that maybe the Christians don't know what they're talking about. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
I see. Okay, so it's maybe more the second thing I was thinking. I mean, yeah, I do think there is disagreement among Christians, of course, on a ton of different issues. You're totally right. I guess my thought on that would be that Christians agree on kind of this core. There's this core beliefs. God exists, and there's God is a Trinity. Jesus is the second member of that Trinity, and Jesus died for our sins and rose from the dead. And maybe there's a few other things in there as well, right? But there's this kind of core of beliefs that Christians agree on. And so I think when you're kind of looking at, I mean, maybe it would be helpful to know what the question is, but when you're kind of looking at Christianity from the outside, I do think, what does it mean to be a Christian? Well, it means to accept these core beliefs that Christians agree on. And I do think Christians can reasonably disagree on a lot of things, moral issues, theological issues. And I think all those people are legitimately Christians. But in the same way that, lots of other religions, the people in those religions disagree on the exact interpretation of those religions. And atheists and agnostics disagree on, whether eating meat is wrong and what's the right political views and all these different things, right? So there is disagreement about some non-core issues among all of these groups, but I do think there's some kind of core beliefs that keep these groups united and make them a cohesive group. Like that is what it is to be a Christian.
I think the answer to that question kind of misses the question, though. It's a little maybe too dismissive. So I'm trying to say this in the most diplomatic way. The denomination that I first grew up in, I can assure you, had core disagreements with a lot of other denominations, to the point that they would definitely have said, no, those people aren't saved. And it is a little bit of a dodge, I think, to say, well, no, Christians agree on the core stuff. Well, some Christians agree on some core stuff, but many skeptics, this is not just something for me, will tell you, no, we encountered disagreement on things that many Christians consider core. And so
could you give an example of that?
Sure. Is baptism necessary for salvation? The answer to that question is the difference between whether you're saved or not.
Yeah, I think you could be a Christian and have different views on that, though. So in that sense, I would say it's not core. There's a difference between core and...
You could if you're on the liberal side of that, but you couldn't if you were on the conservative side of that. So if you said the answer is yes, you have to be baptized to be saved, you don't actually have the choice of having multiple views on that. That is the view.
Well, let's just be
And
clear
so,
though. Oh, okay, go ahead. Sorry.
right, no. So
Okay.
I'm just saying, if a person is being evangelized by two parties, and one says you have to be saved, and another says you don't, that is core, and you have to decide between the two which is right. And it's not sufficient to say, well, we agree on the basic things. That is a basic thing.
Yeah, I think we're just using different definitions of core. But what I would say is core is what makes you a Christian. And I think that, you know, you could believe that you have to be baptized to be saved, and you could believe that you don't have to be baptized to be saved. And both of those people can be Christians. And I hate it when Christian denominations tell other Christian denominations, all of you guys are not Christians, or all of you guys are not saved. Because I think as long as you believe like these things I was talking about, that God exists, that Jesus is God, that he died and rose again, you are a Christian. So whether you believe you have to be baptized to be saved or not, those people are still Christians. I mean, one big question, and maybe this is kind of what your question is what do we say about these important issues that Christians disagree on? How do we kind of adjudicate those? And I think my answer there would be, we need to look at the evidence. We need to look at arguments for and against. We need to interpret the Bible correctly in its historical context. And we need to look at the evidence. But I do think when I say core, I mean what it is to be a Christian, which is, you know, you could believe different things about baptism, and I would say both parties could be Christians.
And the fact that you fail to recognize that baptism is a core belief to many people who are Christians demonstrates my point. You're simply saying, well, that's not core. But they are saying it is core. And so why should I preference your belief that it's not core over their belief that it is?
So would they say that if I think you don't have to be baptized to be saved, I'm not a Christian?
I think most of them would, because if in fact it is true that you have to be baptized to be saved, and you're telling people that you don't, then you're teaching a false doctrine, and people are not in fact coming into contact with the blood of Christ and in relationship with Christ if they're not being baptized. And if you're telling people, no, you don't have to be baptized, then you're not teaching a Christian message at all.
Yeah, but I could still be a Christian. I mean, I think people teach wrong theological views and they're still Christians.
Right, let Liz come back.
Yeah, go ahead. And Dale, I'll let you finish off my thought, because I think you understand where I'm coming from. So that's, I will leave it to you and Liz in the audience to continue to sort that out. I just wanted to get that in, and I think that I felt like I was clear enough in that, but I don't think that Liz quite is connecting with what I'm saying.
Okay. Okay. So I think what David's question is, Liz, and I'll let you have the last word, and then we'll move to the Pascal's wager part. So I think what David is trying to say is there can be this disagreement as to what the definition of a core or essential Christianity is, and what is he as an outsider to do, and should that disagreement make you lower your credence as to what the core of Christianity is in fact? I think is that it, David? Just nod your head. Okay. All right. So
Another example would be speaking in tongues. Some religions used to say, and I think still do say, that's a sign. That's one of the more basic signs. And if you don't, at the very least, speak in tongues, and that's proof that you're not a Christian. For the record, when I was a Christian, I didn't believe that. I also did believe that baptism was essential, but these things by definition are core beliefs.
okay. All right, cool. So let's let Liz respond, and then we'll move on to Pascal's wager.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit complicated here, because there's, arguably there is a distinction between core and non-core. And one question would be, what should we do when we encounter disagreement about a core issue? And what should we do when we encounter disagreement about a non-core issue? So that's one discussion, right? And then I think that was kind of maybe sort of where we started. And then I think we moved into a different question. And that question is, what happens if we disagree about the distinction between the core and the non-core? So what if I think this thing is core and you think this thing isn't core? What do we say about those kinds of disagreements, right? And I think in both like especially in the second case, I guess we can start with that. I think we really do need to look at the evidence. We need to look at the evidence from scripture, look at the evidence from tradition, and evaluate that. And then also look, like I said before at the very beginning, we were talking about disagreement. We need to ask, like, are the people disagreeing with me my epistemic peers? Are they similar reliability to me? Do they have similar evidence to me or not, and I do wonder if, in some of these cases, someone who says you have to speak in tongues to be saved, I think there could be reason to think that person maybe isn't your epistemic peer, because I just think it's really clear that scripture doesn't teach that. And I can probably tell a story about, why, based on the way that they grew up, they came to hold that belief. So I think in some of these cases, the disagreement might not be among peers. I think that's one response we can give. But I think ultimately, the whole disagreement debate is sort of this, it's almost this like pre-looking at the evidence question. Like, if we just disagree, but we haven't really gone and dove into the evidence together, how should I respond? And so I think in a lot of these issues, we need to actually go beyond just that bare, you say P, I say not P thing, and really look at what is the evidence for and against this doctrine. So yeah, I acknowledge there will be important disagreements and even disagreements about what counts as core, but I think it's also important to be clear about what the core means. And what I was saying, like, I think the core is like what it's required to be a Christian. So I think maybe David and I had even some disagreements about how do we define the core as well. Yeah. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, great answer. Yeah, and just to kind of back you up there, Liz, we had Lydia McGrew on, and I was kind of talking to her about this issue of peer disagreement. She's, oh, that's just sociological nonsense. We don't need to worry about that. So, all right, cool. So let's move into the next major topic. So I know Liz is going to be excited about this. This is the issue of Pascal's wager. So yeah, first thing I want to do is kind of turn it over to you, Liz, to explain, okay, what is this Pascal's wager? Maybe give us a bit of a sense of how it's evolved over the years, and then go into your final take and what your Pascal's wager is meant to prove and how it works and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have some slides, so I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen if that's cool.
Yep.
Let's see. Okay. Well, let's see.
It looks like it's coming up. Oh, yeah,
okay. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
So some of these slides were actually from a presentation I gave last week, so I might just fly through a few of them. But I did sort of try to make these based on, the discussion that we're having today. Let me actually move. Sorry. Okay. I'm trying to get all my technology set up. Okay. Can you guys all see that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. So, it'll let me move to the next slide. Okay. So Pascal's wager is different than a lot of the normal arguments for theism. Many theistic arguments, so you think about the ontological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the cosmological argument, they conclude that God exists. And what's different about Pascal's wager is it actually concludes that you should believe in God. So it is a slightly different conclusion. I think this is a big misconception, at least I've seen in some circles. It's not supposed to be an argument that God exists. It's an argument about what you should do. You should believe in God. And this relates to what we were talking about earlier with decision theory. So most versions of Pascal's wager use some version of decision theory to show why, given decision theory, we should believe in God. And again, decision theory tells us about means ends rationality. So it's like, how can you be rational sort of given your credences and then given your desires or what you think would be good? So I don't know if I'm going to go into all of this. This is just kind of an example of how decision theory works. Probably for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over this, but happy to come back to that if either of you want to ask questions about it. But maybe I'll say this really quickly. So one thing we do in decision theory, we can sort of set up our decisions in tables like this one below. So this is an example where I offer you to play a game. You can either play or not play. If you play, I'll flip a coin. If that coin lands heads, I give you $10. If the coin lands tails, you give me $1. And then to figure out whether you should play or not play, you take the probabilities of heads and tails, which is 0.5, and then you multiply down. So you multiply 0.5 times 10, 0.5 times 0, 0.5 times 1, 0.5 times 0, and then you add across. So you add all of the play column up and then all of the play row up and then all of the don't play roll up. And so according to decision theory in this case, what you should do is play. That doesn't mean you're guaranteed to get money if you play one time, but it means that if you played this game with me over and over and over again, you would end up with an average of $4.5 per game. Is that too quick?
No, so just so I know, do you have like strict time constraints,
Not super strict, but you know, are we at, like an hour and a half? I don't know. I'm it's not super strict, so I can go a little slower. So yeah, do either of you have questions about that?
David? Oh, I don't know if he's here. So no, it makes sense to me in terms of what you're saying so far. So yeah, I think you're good to move on.
Okay. Whoops, I just lost I was trying to crap. Okay, sorry. Messing everything up. Okay.
No worries.
So I think
I muted my mic in the video so that it wouldn't distract from your slides.
Oh, okay, cool. If you want to ask a question and interrupt me, you should totally feel free. Okay, so this this kind of example brings us to the most basic version of Pascal's wager. And I will say I'm going to go over this version just kind of for the sake of explaining the argument, but I don't know anyone that actually defends this simple of a version of the argument. And then I'll go into some more ways that people change this argument that I think that make it more plausible. And so basically Pascal's wager, you can see it as a decision problem or a decision question, similar to kind of our play not play case, where your two choices are believe in God or not believe in God. And then the two ways that the world could be that are relevant are that God exists or God doesn't exist. And if you believe in God and God exists, arguably that's infinitely good. If you get to be united with God, go to heaven, there's arguably an infinitely good afterlife. If you don't believe in God and God exists, on some versions of Christianity, you go to hell, which is infinitely bad. There's also versions of Christianity where you're annihilated. On those, the argument can still go through, but the numbers would just look slightly different. And I can, if you guys want to talk about it, there's also versions of Pascal's wager that are consistent with universalism. So I'm happy to talk about that if you guys are interested. But we're going with kind of the more traditional version here. So that's if God exists. And then if God doesn't exist, then it's the argument isn't that you won't gain or lose anything if you believe in God or not believe in God. It's not like those are zeros. The thought is just that if you believe in God or don't believe in God, what you gain or lose is finite. So we can debate about, is it positive? Is it negative? Is it better to believe in God, not believe in God? There's some interesting evidence and even some interesting empirical evidence about, certain benefits that could be associated with believing in God. But if you don't believe in God and God doesn't exist, then you don't have a false belief. Whereas if God doesn't exist and you believe in God, you would have a false belief. So, there's a debate to be had here, but honestly, it doesn't actually really end up mattering because Pascal's wager basically relies on this idea that the infinities are trumping the finites. So we talked about this rule for calculating what's called expected value, which is one of the main rules that we use to figure out what's the rational decision. And then we take that probability. So the probability that God exists is n. The probability that God doesn't exist is 1 minus n. And we multiply that down each column, and then we add each row. And so it looks like believing in God is infinitely better than not believing in God. assuming that the probability that God exists isn't zero. So if you assign God's existence probability 0, that is a way to get out of this argument. But I think there's really good arguments from just what I was talking about, Bayesian epistemology and the norms on credences, that you shouldn't assign God's existence probability 0. A lot of people think you actually shouldn't assign anything probability 0, but if you do assign something probability 0, it's the candidate options for that would be like an explicit contradiction or something like that. So there's some good arguments from Bayesian epistemology that you shouldn't give that probability 0, and as long as you don't do that, the argument can go through. So again, that's the really basic version of the wager. I don't know if anyone defends this simple of a version, but it kind of gets us on the same page to know like what is sort of background reasoning here. Did either of you want to jump in there?
Any questions about that, David? Or?
Well, my question would not be about whether God should be placed at 0, but whether we have any reason to accept the infinites.
So you think maybe like heaven and hell are just finite?
No, I think that they're mythical unless you take a presuppositional view that these are true. So the Bayesian formula, even if you assign God one probability, you still have to accept that there is an infinite good in believing in this God and infinite bad if you don't. And I don't see any reason why one should accept that.
To clarify, you don't have to accept that, you just have to not give that probability 0. So as long as you think there's some chance, even if it's super, 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 super small, that there's an afterlife, then the argument can go through. But I totally agree that if you give the possibility of an afterlife probability 0, then that will be a way to get out of the argument. But I will say, I think the same reasoning I gave to think that you shouldn't assign God's existence probability 0 would apply in that case as well. You would be violating pretty common norms on Bayesian rationality.
I don't see why that would be a common norm, that there's for instance, an infinitely bad hell. Even Christians don't agree on this.
Oh yeah, for sure. So, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's same thing. I don't see any reason to believe that there's an infinitely good heaven. These are just propositional statements, as near as I can tell. And so you're asking me to play a game with these preset rules. But I don't accept these preset rules. I don't accept that there is an infinite harm or an infinite good. And you haven't given me any reason to accept it other than saying, well, those are just the rules.
No, not at all. So again, you don't have to accept it. All you have to do, you can say that the probability that there's a heaven is 0.00000001. You just can't assign it probability 0.
Okay,
so
give me a reason why I can't assign it probability 0.
So
I wouldn't assign it probability anything, because it's not it's like saying there are orcs 100 feet underground below me. What are the probabilities of that? I don't care. I wouldn't assign it probability anything. You haven't given me a reason, let alone a method of assigning any value to an infinite good or an infinite harm.
Okay, so let's come back, and then I want to make sure Liz has time to finish everything.
The reasoning or the method is just based on Bayesian epistemology. And so Bayesian epistemology, some of them say you shouldn't assign any statement, no matter what, even the statement about orcs, probability 0, because we just can't be 100% sure that anything is true or anything is false. We can be very, 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 I think it's very, 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 very likely. But, even Descartes, I think therefore I am. It's like Hume said, you haven't proved that there's a self. Maybe there's a thought, maybe there's a belief, but you haven't proved that there's a self. So I think even that we shouldn't assign probability 1 to. So that's one thought. But then even if you think there are some things we should give probability 0, those are things that are either explicit contradictions or, like things like 1 + 1 = 3, P and not P, like those kinds of things. And so that there is an afterlife wouldn't fall into that camp. So it's a very, very, very low burden of proof here. It's just saying you have to think, you could think there's a 0.00000001 chance that there's an afterlife, that there's a heaven, or that there's a hell. But as long as you think that, the argument can go through. And I think one thing that's interesting to even think about is what we were just talking about earlier with pure disagreement. I mean, a lot of smart people believe in an afterlife. A lot of smart people at least believe in heaven. Some believe in hell as well. Like you said, there's disagreement about this. And so I think even the fact of that disagreement should make your credence in heaven or in hell, a little bit higher. Even if it's not drastically changing your credence, I think it should change your credence a little bit. So those are sort of some considerations, but again, it's a very low standard. You don't have to believe in heaven or believe in hell. You just have to basically say they're not contradictions, they're not things we give probability 0 to. So hopefully that's clear.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I think I already said that. Okay, so one really common objection to Pascal's wager is what's called the many gods objection. So this objection is basically like, look, you've set up the wager in terms of believing in God and not believing in God, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. There's Christianity, there's Islam, there's a bunch of religions, and let's say you practice Christianity and Islam is true, or you believe in Christianity and Islam is true. It's not at all clear that you're gonna get an infinite good just by believing in God. You kind of have to pick the right religion. And so what's interesting here, look at this decision table, and it's like, well, when we look at the final expected values, it looks like Christianity and Islam, believing Christianity, believing Islam, it's basically the same expected value. And then you might say, well, at the very least, it seems like what you shouldn't do is don't believe in God, right? That seems like an irrational decision. But here's what's important. Let me go back to this slide first, actually. Let's say we included another column on our decision table, and that column represents this possibility. Atheists go to heaven and theists go to hell. You might say that's unlikely. You might say if there's an afterlife, that's probably not what happens in the afterlife. But what I was just saying earlier is like, we should only assign probability 0, maybe not to anything, or maybe only to explicit contradictions, right? And that doesn't seem like it involves an explicit contradiction. It's at least possible, even if it's very unlikely. And so if we included that column in this decision table, what it would actually mean is that it wouldn't even give us a reason to practice a religion at all, because there's this chance that atheists go to heaven and theists go to hell. And so the many gods objection is actually pretty bad. What it means is that we don't really have a way to, it's not like we can't only not choose between religions, it just doesn't tell us what to believe at all. Okay, so that's the many gods objection. And here's I want to now respond to the many gods objection and maybe clarify it a little bit. So part of what the many gods objection is assuming is it's assuming that infinity has what's called an absorption property. And what that means is that you take any number n, and as long as n isn't 0, you multiply that by infinity and you get infinity. And so in our decision table before, we had probability of Christianity, probability of Islam, probability that God doesn't exist. Those were A, B, C, right? So we multiply A times infinity, that's infinity, multiply B times infinity, that's infinity. And then I said there's this possibility that atheists go to heaven and theists go to hell. Let's call that D. D times infinity, it's infinity. And so if infinity does have this absorption property, it makes it so that we really can't, it seems like we can't choose between religions, and we can't even choose between worldviews in general, because infinities are just absorbing the probabilities. But, and here's where I think this objection is actually just super wrong and very confused. I think there's a good reason to think that infinity does not absorb probabilities in this way, especially in our decision making. And here's a thought experiment that I've given before, but I think is really helpful. So let's say you're like on a game show or something, and the host gives you a chance between 2 doors. And behind each door, there's some chance that you'll get something that's infinitely good, but in neither case is it guaranteed. Behind door number 1, there's a 0.9 chance, a 90% chance at getting this infinite good. And then behind door number 2, there's a 0.1 chance. There's a 10% chance at getting this infinite good. So notice, if we were just doing decision theory and assuming that infinities have this absorption property, we would take the probability, multiply by the utility, and it would look like both doors have an infinite expected value. So because infinity is absorbing the differences in probability. But that is clearly absurd. This has nothing to do with Pascal's wager. This isn't an argument that's saying, it's not begging the question. I think there's totally independent reason to just think, this can't be the right result here. We should clearly pick the door that gives us the higher chance at the infinite good rather than the door that gives us the lower chance at the infinite good. And so the lesson is that when we're making decisions, even decisions involving infinite goods, probability matters. And we should go for a higher chance at getting an infinite good rather than a lower chance. Okay, so there's sort of two ways that we can fix Pascal's wager in light of this observation. The first way is that we actually just get rid of infinities altogether. So we only have a finite version of Pascal's wager. And then the upshot here is that if a religion is sufficiently probable, you should wager on it. So Mike Rhoda has a book, it's called Taking Pascal's Wager, and he thinks if that a religion is at least 0.5 likely, then you should wager on it. The pro here is that we get rid of the complications caused by infinity, but the con is that we lose some of the original power of the wager, because it's not like it doesn't matter what probability you should wager on it. The probability has to be at least, say, 0.5, or we could move that threshold around. We would just have to play around with other numbers in our decision table. So that's the first way. The second way to sort of fix Pascal's wager in light of this is that we need to adjust the math, specifically this absorption property, which I think we have a totally independent reason to reject. And basically what we want to capture is the idea that all infinities are not created equal, and we should go for our higher chance at getting an infinite good rather than our lower chance. So the pro here is that you can get a stronger result, and namely that you should wager for the religion that you take to be most probable. But the con here is that things do get kind of technical and complex, and I'm probably not going to go into all the math here. There's also different ways of formally modeling this, but I have two papers on this slide. One is a paper that I wrote with a co-author. It's called Salvaging Pascal's Wager, and then there's another paper that kind of does a similar thing with surreal numbers. So if you're sort of interested in the math, I would recommend going and checking those out. But on either way of going, once we kind of embrace this idea that probability matters, we have an answer to the many gods objection. So I think I have a few more slides with some other objections to the wager. Do we want to pause there, or do we want to keep going?
So yeah, I think just how many is it, like the other objections, like the other questions?
Let's see. So, whoops. So it's the impossibility objection, like we can't control our beliefs at will, the irrationality objection, the Homer-Simpson objection, and Pascal's mugging. I think I just had those four. So it's like
I would actually like to hear those objections.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, finish off the presentation, and then I'll give the remainder of the time for the informal discussion between you guys.
Yeah, even if we don't have time for an informal discussion, I think a lot of people have the same questions, and I think that these slides would at least give your scholarly view of them. And so I think it's more important that you finish the presentation.
Cool. All right, over to you then, Liz.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks. Yeah, so there's like four more objections I wanted to talk about. The first is what's called the impossibility objection. So the impossibility objection says it's impossible to take Pascal's wager because we just don't have the right kind of control over our beliefs. So the thought is, look, believe in God, not believe in God, that's how we had set up the wager initially, but I'm not in a situation where I can just make myself believe in God, even if I'm convinced on the basis of Pascal's wager that I should. So even if I should wager, I can't. I can't take Pascal's wager. It's impossible. So I basically have three main responses to this objection. And this gets into, I think we mentioned briefly this idea that I have that I think in certain situations we can control our beliefs. So my first response, and definitely the most controversial response, is that in some cases, and I acknowledge this may not apply to everyone, but I do think in some cases, some people can control their beliefs in God directly. And one thing that's really important to note here is this does not mean that we can control all of our beliefs in every situation. So a lot of people that argue we can't control our beliefs, they'll say, I'll give you $100 to believe the sky is green or something. And it's like, I can't do that. But it's this proposition that is clearly false. You know the sky is blue, it's not green. And so you can't control your belief because your evidence just clearly points in one direction in that case.
Okay.
But what I think is really interesting is thinking about cases where your evidence is a lot more complicated and harder to evaluate, and you even feel really torn between multiple options. And I think in those cases, we arguably have a lot more control over our belief in God. So I'm going to come back to responses 2 and 3, but I want to go to the next slide really quick because I think there's a really interesting example of this. So Peter Van Inwagen is a philosopher who taught at Notre Dame for a long time, and he has a autobiography where he describes his conversion process. And here's a quote from it. He says, "First, I can remember having a picture of the cosmos, the physical universe, as a self-subsistent thing, something that's just there and requires no explanation." So he was not a theist at this point. And he could kind of call up this image of the cosmos, and it's just there. It doesn't require an explanation. There's no God. It's just kind of there by itself. And then he says, I can still call this image to mind, and it still represents the whole world. But now, after his conversion, it's associated with a felt conviction that it represents something that's not self-subsistent. It represents something that must depend on something else, something that's not represented by a feature of that image. It's not part of the world, but bigger than that, bigger than the world, something beyond the world, and that's God. And so he says, this is the part that's really important for us. So this is that last highlighted part at the end. Interestingly enough, there was a period of transition, a period that I could move back and forth at will in a duck rabbit fashion between experiencing the world, so experiencing the image that represents the world as self-subsistent and experiencing the image that represents the world as dependent. And I have this duck rabbit picture on the slide because I think it's really interesting. You can kind of see it as a duck, see it as a rabbit. And so I do think that sometimes some of us are in this situation, and not just about theism, but like, let's say we have a bunch of evidence and we're thinking about 2 different pretty good explanations of that evidence. The ground is wet. Did it rain or is it just dew? You know, and you're kind of going back and forth in between those 2 options. And what I think is really interesting about Peter Van Inwagen's quote here is he says he could actually move back and forth at will and sort of see the world in both of these ways. And so I'm open to the possibility that at least in some cases, some people can control their belief in God directly and move back and forth at will if they're sort of looking at maybe competing explanations for the universe, God versus, you know, the universe is self-subsistent or whatever. So that's kind of my most controversial response, and I know that it won't convince everyone. So the second response that I think is pretty plausible is that you can control your belief in God, but just indirectly. So you can control your belief in God by who you hang out with, what you read, what websites you go to, what books you're reading, you know, the communities that you're absorbed in. All of these things affect our beliefs and affect our worldview. And so even if you can't directly control your belief in God, I think almost everyone working in this literature, a lot of them would disagree with me that you can control your belief in God directly, at least in some cases, but almost everyone working on doxastic voluntarism is the view, would say that you can at least control your belief in God indirectly. So I think that's pretty uncontroversial. And then the third response that some people do, and this is Mike Roda's way of going, is he actually just gets rid of belief altogether. So Pascal's wager isn't about whether we should believe in God or not believe in God or believe in a certain religion, but it's about whether we should commit to God, whether we should make a commitment to praying, reading the Bible, going to church. So it's just about whether we should take certain actions. It's not about whether we should believe or even try to believe. So I think there's kind of 3 different responses depending on sort of the way you want to take things. Okay, so that's the impossibility objection. Now I want to move to a second objection, which is the irrationality objection. So the irrationality objection says that Beliefs that are formed for practical reasons. So let's say that like you're convinced by my last response and you think, yeah, we can control our beliefs in the way that you describe. Even if we can do that, it still seems like the beliefs that are formed on the basis of something like Pascal's wager are epistemically irrational. It seems like if you're just believing because, you know, that you did this decision problem and you're trying to like maximize or minimize, you know, expected value, like maximize expected value, let's just say, like, yeah, like, maybe even if we can believe on that basis, it seems like you're not following your evidence. What you should be doing is following your evidence. And so these beliefs seem epistemically irrational. Okay, so the first response is like very concessive, and it's not my favorite response, but I put it on there just because it's worth mentioning. And so the first response says, okay, well, maybe taking Pascal's wager is epistemically irrational. Maybe it isn't following your evidence. But the epistemic isn't all that we're concerned with. We also care about, you know, we want to get knowledge. That is an important goal in our life. But we also want to be happy. You know, we want to have a good life, and we want to maximize sort of expected value. We want to take into account certain risks, certain rewards. And so even if Pascal's wager is epistemically irrational, epistemic rationality isn't the end of the story, and that's not the only kind of rationality. And so, oh, there's a typo on the slide, but it should say it's still maybe practically or all things considered rational. Again, not my favorite response because I don't like the idea that we should just ignore evidence, but it is a way you can go. You could say, yeah, it's not epistemically rational, but it's at least rational in these other ways. Okay, so that's response one. Response two, it comes back to permissivism, what we were talking about earlier. And I think it's really interesting to think about the possibility that some people are in a permissive case with respect to the question of theism. And this actually relates to what I was saying earlier, where I think there's good arguments for God's existence, but there's also good arguments against. And the evidence is just really complicated. There's lots of aspects of it, and it can be really hard to evaluate. And so I do think that maybe not all of us, but a good number of us could be rational in taking multiple different attitudes towards the question of whether God exists. You know, maybe you're an agnostic, but you still think there are some compelling arguments for God's existence. So it wouldn't be irrational for you to be a theist. Maybe it wouldn't be irrational for you to be an atheist either. And so the thought is, if you're in a case like this, you know, maybe two or maybe even all three belief attitudes fit your evidence. And so if you're in that case, then believing that God exists, assuming that's one of the permitted attitudes for you, that's going to actually be by definition epistemically irrational. So this would be another case like we were talking about before, where the practical is breaking an epistemic tie. The attitudes are epistemically tied. They're both equally rational given your evidence. And so then the practical is kind of determining which attitude you take. Okay, and the final thing I want to say about the irrationality objection is that if you frame the wager in terms of commitment, like Mike Rhoda does, and you don't make it about belief at all, then this objection doesn't really come up, because you're not like forming beliefs that don't fit the evidence, you're just acting in certain ways. Okay, so that's the irrationality objection. Only two more objections. Do you want me to, does someone want to say something?
No, keep going if you're
okay.
Finish off, and then I'll bring David in at the end. So
yeah, for sure. So just two more objections and then we're done. So this objection, so this is definitely my co-author and I made up this label, but I think it's kind of fun. So it's called the Homer Simpson objection. And Homer Simpson at one point says, suppose we've chosen the wrong God. Every time we go to church, we're just making him madder and madder. And it's kind of a joke, but I think it actually gets at a legitimate objection to Pascal's wager. And that's this. What if practicing a religion is risky? Because if you're practicing the wrong religion, it makes God mad. So it's better to be kind of neutral as an atheist rather than accidentally get it wrong and practice the wrong religion and make God mad. So that's what we call the Homer Simpson objection. And I think we have basically, I'm going to talk about two responses here in the longer version of the paper, the Salvaging Pascal's Wager paper. We actually have 4 total responses, so you can look there for some more if you're really interested in this, but here's 2 of our main ones. So the first is like, look, even if you fully embrace this idea that Homer's putting forward and you say, yeah, there is this big risk to practicing a religion, so we should just be a neutral atheist. In some sense, you are still taking Pascal's wager because you're considering the afterlife in your decision making. So the main point of the version of Pascal's wager that we want to put forth, I think the most fundamental thing is like, people need to think about the afterlife in their decision making and consider that when they're deciding to do what to do right now, because there's so much at stake. There's so many potential gains and losses in the afterlife. So even if we fully agree with Homer's theology, I think this is actually the one kind of way of taking Pascal's wager that's consistent with being an atheist or an agnostic. So that's kind of the more concessive response. Okay, so response number 2 is less concessive, and I think it's basically saying, I think there's some good reason to doubt Homer's theology, which is that practicing the wrong religion is going to make God really mad, but if you're just a neutral atheist, maybe, you know, God won't be so harsh on you in the afterlife. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So the first is that religions prescribe the same kinds of actions, such as helping the poor, attending religious services, tithing. There's some interesting arguments that, you know, maybe even Christians and Muslims are worshiping the same God. So there's some, I think there's an interesting thing. It's like, maybe the religions are kind of getting closer, getting at something similar, and then being an atheist is kind of outside of that or different. And I think here's a thought experiment that can kind of illustrate that nicely. So imagine you have 2 children and you invite them both to your 50th wedding anniversary. The first child comes to the party, but brings you a gift that isn't exactly what you wanted because they have some false beliefs about your desires. And the second child ignores your invitation completely and says you don't exist. So which is the better child? And I don't think this is a totally decisive thought experiment that just totally disproves Homer's theology, but I do think there is good reasons to doubt that God would be super jealous if you practice the wrong religion, but not totally fine, but strongly prefer you to just say God doesn't exist and ignore God's existence altogether. Okay, so those are 2 of our responses to the Homer-Simpson objection. And then we'll talk about our last objection. Okay.
Oh, good.
This one's fun. I really like this one. So this is what's called Pascal's mugging. This is actually a paper that was written by Nick Bostrom in Analysis, and it's just a dialogue. So I actually really recommend people go look at it if they're interested, because it's a super fun paper. So here's the basic summary of it. So Pascal is walking home late at night through a dark alley, and a mugger comes up to Pascal and says, "Give me your wallet." And Pascal's like, "Why should I give you my wallet? Like, you don't have a weapon. Like, there's no reason for me to give you your wallet. I'm just gonna leave." And the mugger's like, "Dang it, that's a good point." And he's like, if you give me your wallet right now, tomorrow I'm going to deposit $1 million in your bank account. So yeah, you'll lose maybe like $100 and then, you know, a credit card or 2, but you'll get $1 million tomorrow. And, you know, even if you think it's likely that I'm lying, there's at least some chance that I'm telling the truth. And so look at the gains and losses. Like, you know, there's a small chance that you could get this really great reward, right? So just give me your wallet, just take the risk. It's totally worth it. And so it's you know, it's kind of funny, but at the end of this paper, Pascal ends up giving the mugger his wallet. So it's kind of I think it's a really fun and kind of funny thought experiment. But here's the way, maybe more seriously, that I think it does challenge Pascal's wager. You can even just put it in a premise conclusion form argument. Premise 1 says that Pascal should not give the mugger his wallet. Premise 2 says that if Pascal should not give the mugger his wallet, then I shouldn't take Pascal's wager. So premise 3, therefore, I should not take Pascal's wager. So here's how I want to respond to Pascal's mugging. I think we need to deny premise 2. So premise 1, Pascal shouldn't give the mugger his wallet. I think that's a solid premise. I want to say yes, that is true. So, well, yeah, thank you. So what I want to argue is that there's important differences or asymmetries between Pascal's mugging and Pascal's wager. So I think there's a couple different ones. I think the first thing to note is that as the mugger's claims get more extreme, Pascal's should think that the probability that the mugger is lying is higher and higher. So let me illustrate. If the mugger says, if you give me your wallet today, I'll give you $10 tomorrow, I think the probability the mugger is lying, maybe it's still decently likely, but it's going to be a lot lower than if the mugger says, I'll give you $1 million. And then it's going to be a lot lower if the mugger says, I have a button that I'm going to push that's going to destroy the whole world or something, then it's going to be even lower. And so if your probabilities work like this, what you can actually get is that no matter what the mugger says, as his claims about what he's going to do get bigger, your probability gets lower. You actually shouldn't give the mugger your wallet, and you can totally model that using decision theory, because remember, what you should do is a function of how good some outcome is, but also what that probability is. And so I think that's going to be potentially an important difference between Pascal's wager and Pascal's mugging, is that as the claims get more extreme, the probability gets lower. Here's the second way that I think this is maybe even a more compelling response to Pascal's mugging. And that's that sometimes it's rational to take a chance on a low probability, but really good outcome, even if that comes with a cost. And so one example of this is, let's say you've been in you've had a really, really painful illness your entire life that's really just disrupted you. It's just really made your life really difficult. And then a doctor comes to you and says, and then there's no cure for this. You've seen lots of doctors. No one can figure out what's going on. A doctor comes to you and says, I think I found a medicine that could cure you, but there's like a 5% chance. So it is pretty unlikely. And also the medicine's very new, so it's extremely expensive. So maybe you have to pay like $10,000 to get it. I think this could be a case where, look, even if the medicine is expensive and there's just a pretty low probability it will cure you, it's still worth paying some cost to get that low probability good, because of how good that outcome would be if you were actually cured from your illness. Another example is, there's these like low probability catastrophes, like a worldwide nuclear war, or maybe some extreme global warming that like kills a bunch of the world population, let's say. These things are arguably relatively unlikely, but there's actually charities that are designed to fight these low probability catastrophes. And I think it could totally be rational to donate some money to one of those charities, even though those catastrophes are really unlikely, because of how bad it would be if one of those catastrophes occurred. And so these are both examples of these cases where you should pay some cost to get a low probability but really good outcome. And so, what we need to do then is, look, Pascal's mugging. We've already said that's irrational, don't give him your wallet. But fighting these, low probability worldwide nuclear wars, trying this low probability medicine, those seem rational. It seems like there are cases like that where you should do that. And so what we have to do is we have to say, when are cases of this structure rational and when are cases of this structure irrational? And we have to find some way to draw that line. That's actually a really hard problem, but some philosophers are working on that. But the point is just that it's not obvious that Pascal's wager is going to fall on the irrational side of the line rather than the rational side of the line. So that's my basic response to Pascal's mugging.
Awesome. All right, perfect. So I know that we're a little bit over time, so maybe about 10, 15 minutes and then we'll finish. So just before I go to the opening, Liz, do you want to give just maybe a few minutes on your take about how does Pascal's wager relate to the problem of divine hiddenness? What's your take on that very quickly, and then?
For sure. Actually, you might have seen I have a slide on it, so I'll just say it really briefly. So divine hiddenness is this puzzle about why, if God is all loving and wants a relationship with all of his creatures and also all powerful, why God would seem hidden to certain people. And common versions of the argument from divine hiddenness rely on what's called a non-resistant non-believer. So a non-resistant non-believer is someone that doesn't believe that God exists, but through no fault of their own. And so the argument goes something like this. It's, if God exists and God's all good and all powerful, there would be no non-resistant non-believers, because God would do everything that God can to make sure that God has a relationship with all people. So really the only thing that would hold someone back from a relationship with God would be if it's due to some kind of fault of their own. But it seems like there are people that don't know that God exists through no fault of their own. Seems like there are non-resistant non-believers. So by modus tollens, it's, Schellenberg argues there is no all good, all powerful God. So that's the basic problem. And here's just a super quick gloss on my response. I think previously, when people were thinking about, are there non-resistant non-believers? There are some people that try to deny that there are non-resistant non-believers across the board. But previously, when they were kind of looking at that question, people were assuming that you could be a non-resistant non-believer simply if you fulfill your epistemic duties. So if you look at the evidence carefully, you weigh the arguments for and against, and you kind of epistemically responsibly look at the question of whether God exists. So most people were just focusing on epistemic duties here. And then what I point out is like, look, it doesn't seem like all that matters here is only epistemic duties. It seems like we should also fulfill our practical duties. And when the stakes are higher, it seems like we need to look into a question more. We talked about some examples of that earlier, how, if if the cops come and there's a murder in the philosophy department, you need to get more evidence before you can conclude that Rachel was in the philosophy department today. So people, in order to be a non-resistant non-believer, need to fulfill their practical duties. And then the thought is, well, if Pascal's wager is right, then our practical duties with respect to God's existence might be pretty significant. In fact, the stakes are infinitely high. And what I argue here, I'm not necessarily trying to argue that there's no non-resistant non-belief at all, but I think there's less non-resistant non-belief than we might have previously thought. Because we were only focusing on epistemic duties, and I think we need to bring practical duties in as well. So then you would have to combine my argument with other responses to divine hiddenness to get a full response to it, but I think it's significant if there's less non-resistant non-belief than we thought before. So that's my basic response.
Excellent. Yeah, I wanted to make sure we got that in because it kind of, the resistant non-believer notion kind of relates to my criteria for being a real seeker. So the name, arose by any other name, same thing. But yeah, David, so out of fairness, we'll have about 10 minutes, just out of respect for Liz's time constraints, to do an informal back and forth. So David, it's totally open up to you. What do you want to ask Liz about or challenge Liz's idea on Pascal's wager?
I don't know, probably about 2 hours worth of stuff.
You got 10 minutes.
All right. Well, let's start with Pascal's mugging, since that's the freshest in my mind. I'm not sure how your objection, I don't see how that helps, actually. Pascal's mugging seems like a pretty good thought experiment. And one of the things that you said that made the mugging less likely is, as the stakes go up. So the mugger says, well, I'll give you $100 if you give me your wallet today. And then you say no, and so he says, okay, 1,000. Well, okay, 10 billion. And you're saying as those stakes go up, it actually becomes less likely. So Pascal's wager amps the stakes up to infinity. So it's still the same scenario. Well, you should, maybe try Pascal's wager because you'll live a happier life. No. Well, how about this? You'll live forever. Well, how about this? You'll live forever with never-ending bliss. It just seems like a way of increasing the stakes. And so it seems very compatible with Pascal's mugging to me. And for similar reasons why Pascal shouldn't give his wallet over to the mugger, I think you shouldn't give your life over to the wager. Explain to me again how that's different.
Yeah, so the thought is that because of the structure of the mugging case, it's just what you said, as the mugger's claims get more and more extreme, your credence that the mugger is telling the truth should lower in proportion. But I don't think that Pascal's wager has that same feature. I don't think that a religion that posits an infinitely good heaven is going to be, then you would have an infinitely small credence in that religion, or a credence of 0 in that religion. So I guess the thought is just, if there really is an all-powerful God, I don't think it's that unlikely that there is an afterlife that's infinitely good. And that is something that we should take seriously in our decision making. So I don't think that given kind of God's existence, an afterlife is this really unlikely thing. But I think given the structure of the mugging case, the more the mugger says he's going to give you, I think the more we should be skeptical of what the mugger is claiming. So I guess I would just say that your credence shouldn't decrease in proportion to whether a religion has an afterlife that's infinitely good, because I think it makes sense that that would be something that would be true if religions are true, but it also makes sense that the more extreme the mugger's claim is, the more likely that he's lying.
Okay, so theologically, I would disagree with you, because if you just start with the Bible from the first page, there's no afterlife. Adam and Eve are not facing eternal consequences. They're facing live or die, but they're not facing like life in heaven or life in hell. Most Jews don't believe in that today. So there is actually an escalation throughout the Bible theologically of the eschatological conclusion. It does then follow to me that the theological story is very similar to the Pascal's mugger story, because it does, the stakes do get increasingly higher in both directions the further you go down the Bible.
Yeah, sure. No, I agree. I think that is a really interesting kind of idea that the people in the Old Testament didn't have the same conception of the afterlife. And I think where I would get off the boat is that the more of the Bible you get through, or the more of the Bible you read, your credence should just drop in proportion, right? So I actually think when I get to Jesus and when I read the Gospels and I read about Jesus's life and like the way he treated the least of these, and just, the people he cared about and the lifestyle that he lived, and I know this isn't true for everyone, but that increases my credence in Christianity, and increases, so I think it actually becomes more likely the more of the Bible you read and the more things are revealed, and yeah, the afterlife becomes clearer, but I don't think that doesn't make my credence decrease. And even if that doesn't make your credence increase like it makes mine increase, I don't see why reading more of the Bible would make your credence decrease. And I do think even skeptics find the New Testament and Jesus's life attractive in certain ways and potentially less puzzling than the Old Testament. I actually find some parts of the Old Testament kind of puzzling, and the New Testament is in some ways easier to swallow. So
I'm not questioning your theological conclusions. I am questioning that Pascal's mugging is somehow not compatible. Theologically, it is compatible in that it starts off with smaller stakes and increases ever so gently throughout the Testaments. So it does seem that way to me. Listeners will ultimately have to decide, but I think that you're being a little arbitrary if you're saying, well, you should discount Pascal's mugging because this guy just seems to be adding stakes, but you should accept the wager, even though the Bible, biblically, theologically, you seem to add stakes all the way up to infinity. Those of us who are skeptics would say, wait a minute, it didn't seem that likely when we were in Genesis, and now it's going all the way to infinity. So we would see it that way. Homer Simpson objection, I just wanted to touch on that one too. Again, I would say theologically, I disagree, or I may not be understanding fully what you're saying there. But the Homer Simpson objection, just to recap, is the one that says, well, you might be worshiping the wrong God, making God angry by worshiping potentially the wrong God. That is theologically correct. So I would go back to, um, I don't have the passage in front of me, probably someplace in Deuteronomy, because a lot of strange things are in Deuteronomy. But it's in a command of God that if your uh, wife, your daughter, your son come and tell you, let's go worship these other gods, you should actually put them to death with your own hand, um, because it was so offensive to suggest that, another God should be worshipped. And so we do read that God is a jealous God, and at least at that part of the Bible, a violently jealous God. And Homer Simpson could be right. Um, if you got the wrong religion or worshiping the wrong God somehow, that's extremely dangerous. Um, so again, I don't. I'm not sure how you dismiss that objection quite so easily, because that objection would concern me long before before I hear it from you as the Homer Simpson objection. I will forevermore call it the Homer Simpson objection now. But I would say that Homer Simpson has a pretty good grasp of theology.
Yeah, so I want to say two quick points. The first is just on the Pascal's mugging thing. When you're going through the Bible, it is potentially true that you are adding stakes, especially as the afterlife becomes revealed more and more. But the crucial disanalogy is supposed to be about what is happening with your credence. And in Pascal's mugging, as you add stakes, your credence arguably should lower because of the evidence that you're getting. But I think as you go through the Bible, it's not at all clear that your credence should lower. And I think in a lot of cases, people's credence raise because of the really amazing life that Jesus lived. So it's not just about adding stakes, it's about what should your credence do? What is that evidence doing to your credence? And so the reason that I think it's different is that I don't think your credence is lowering in the same way in the Pascal's wager case that it is in the mugging case. So I just wanted to clarify that. So on the Homer Simpson thing, I think it's interesting to look at scripture, and there is even, I think, a scripture that says God is a jealous God, and I totally agree with that. And I think the main answer to your objection there is that practicing a religion isn't the only way to worship the wrong God. It's not the only way to worship something. And the Homer Simpson objection relies on this idea that those who practice a religion are going to be worse off in the afterlife than atheists and agnostics. So the objection can only get off the ground if, maybe atheists and agnostics are annihilated and then those who practice the wrong religion go to hell. Or maybe there's different levels and atheists and agnostics go to the higher level and those who practice the wrong religion go to the deepest level of hell. So it's really it's really a comparative point about being an atheist and agnostic versus practicing a wrong religion. And then the thought is, well, even if atheists and agnostics aren't practicing a religion, there's still something they're centering their life on and something they're worshiping that isn't God. And arguably, God would be just as displeased with that as someone who's practicing the wrong religion. So it's more of a comparative point than a point about God wanting or not wanting you to worship something else.
Yeah, it might be just one of those theological differences that we had. That growing up, I would have said that, for instance, practicing the wrong religion is just as bad as practicing no religion. In fact, practicing no religion may be better, because, say, if you're a Catholic and you're praying to Mary and you're venerating saints and using statues as idols, as an example, that would be those are things that would definitely get you the worst kind of punishment. You would be better off just to remain agnostic than to do that. So, that just may be a theological difference. But I actually, if for instance it is true that God would take offense to your praying to Mary and saints, I don't think that you are better off praying to Mary and saints. It's especially if you're religious and you had access to knowledge that you should pray to Jesus and not to people. Then it seems like a type of rebellion almost, whereas the agnostic is not practicing a type of rebellion. They just don't know.
Yeah, so actually, I think a lot of what you said is consistent with my response and consistent with Pascal's wager. You could say that practicing the wrong religion and being an atheist or agnostic are equally bad. That's totally consistent. What you would need to get the objection off the ground is that those who practice the wrong religion, it's significantly worse than being an atheist or agnostic. So you would have to get a pretty strong claim to get the Homer Simpson thing off the ground. So I think I think we're actually in agreement on a lot of what you said.
Yeah. Well, God never told his people to go kill atheists on the basis that they're atheists. He did tell his people to kill your own kids if they bring to you the wrong God. So I actually think that there might be, his jealousy might actually be the bigger challenge there. But once again, this really depends on kind of how you understand God and cash out some of those particular scriptures. Theologically, I think that's the case. I wanted to address one other thing within the 10 minutes that I know that I've already exhausted at this point. So hang on, Dale. I'm willing to call this the last thing.
Okay, cool.
So this idea that you should just do it, whether you believe it or not. I don't think we have time to address whether you can believe it. So just know that I appreciate your bringing those things up. There are responses to those. We just don't have time to do. But the idea that Mike, what was his name?
Mike Rhoda.
Mike Rhoda. This Rhoda doctrine that you should just do it, whether you believe it or not, I think is probably the most theologically unsound idea of the wager. It's simply not possible. So if we take the impossibility argument and you try to defeat that by saying, well, it doesn't matter whether you actually believe or not, you just do it, then you're reducing God and worship of God to a series of acts which God has made it clear he doesn't care about. He does not demand sacrifice. For instance, sacrifice is something that comes up to him as a foul smell if your heart is not right. What he demands is a broken and contrite heart. And so the idea that you just go through the motions and fool God or appease God because you did the motions is multiply biblically attested to be untrue. It's about the most untrue thing in the whole package. And so I just wonder how you respond to that. This idea that God will overlook the fact that you didn't really believe and you were just taking a bet so that you could get a better afterlife.
Yeah, I actually have a whole entire paper where I kind of address this in detail. So we just don't, unfortunately, have time to go into all of the details of it. But definitely the idea is not that you're in some way fooling God or making God think you're a Christian when you're not. Like, of course, God sees your motives and sees why you're doing things. And I also think it's worth noting, too, that I'm not at all in the position that it's, impossible to take Pascal's wager with bad motives. I totally think that you can. But I think the thought is this, like, look, if I commit to God and God exists, that would be a really good outcome. Like, if there really is this all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing being, and I have the possibility of pursuing a relationship with that God, that would be awesome. I'm not convinced that there is that being, but I think it would be a good thing to know God and be in a relationship with God and be united with God if God exists. And so I'm going to do everything I can to be in a relationship with God, including making sacrifices of my time and money and going to church and tithing and praying and pursuing God. Is this going to, guarantee salvation? I mean, that's a huge theological issue, but I think at the very least, it's going to put you on a path that makes it much more likely you'll be saved than someone that makes no effort at all and isn't pursuing God. So I think that's the thought. Mike Roda talks a lot more about this in his book, but I also have a paper that's called Faithfully Taking Pascal's Wager. And in that paper, what I try to argue is that there's a way of taking Pascal's wager that actually exemplifies genuine biblical faith in God. So again, I don't have time to go into all the details there, and the point isn't that you can't take Pascal's wager with bad motives, but I also think you can take it with good motives and in ways that demonstrate genuine faith.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, with that said, as I said, we've gone a little bit over time, so my apologies as the host for that. But yeah, I just want to say thank you guys so much. I really enjoyed this combo. I hope on your guys' end, you guys had a good time as well.
Yeah, thank you so much to you both. Thanks, David, for interacting with my work. I feel like I just really appreciate your patience and taking the time to interact with things that I'm interested in. So I appreciate that. And Dale, thank you so much for setting this up and having us on. So yeah, I had a lot of fun.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. As you guys know, you guys are both welcome back anytime on any topics that you guys like. So yeah, this will be great. For the audience, I'm going to post up links to the various sources that Liz has, so you can click on that and read if you want more detail and that sort of thing. But yeah, other than that, have a great week to everyone. All right, take care.
Thanks so much.